same chain, Peace Olympics. I feel quite privileged to be here to experience this historic moment in inter-Korean relations. To witness the ancient spirit of the Olympic Games materialize in today's geopolitical climate is tremendously inspiring. I join the ranks of cautious optimists in welcoming the recent talks between the South and North. As an American advocating to the U.S. government for a peaceful resolution to the conflict, I hope these talks will continue to create an atmosphere of reconciliation and dialogue even after the games have ended and the athletes have gone home. While I do not want to distract from these important and productive talks, I must focus my attention for the majority of this speech to the relations between the United States and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or DPRK. I do this for two reasons. First, as an American, I do not believe it is my place to comment on length on inter-Korean relations. These dialogues, and indeed the final resolution of this conflict, must be led and shaped by Koreans. Second, the U.S. has and will continue to be a critical player in this conflict. And at the moment, the U.S. is the nation that must get in the games, so to speak, and begin engaging the DPRK. The Trump administration has dubbed its policy toward the DPRK as maximum pressure and engagement. It is unclear to many in the U.S. when, how, or if the administration will pursue the engagement aspect of this policy. What is clear is the administration's use of maximum pressure. This policy has manifested in many ways that have escalated tensions, such as the deployment of more military assets to the region, an aggressive implementation of sanctions, bombastic and reckless rhetoric, public communications building support for military action, travel restrictions which limit people-to-people connections, and the use of unilateral mechanisms designed to isolate enemies of the state, such as the inclusion of the DPRK on the state sponsors of terrorism list. The Trump administration continues to justify such policies under the assumption that they will bring the DPRK to the negotiating table. This reasoning, however, is flawed. These policies serve only to heighten tensions, sow insecurity among Koreans and U.S. citizens alike, and reinforce the DPRK's suspicions of the U.S.'s intentions. Many in the U.S. compare U.S.-DPRK relations to U.S.-Iranian relations. This comparison ignores the long, unique history of the Korean conflict, however, and the U.S.'s legal obligations to faithfully pursue a peace treaty as indicated in the Armistice Agreement. Sadly, in my conversations in the U.S., I find myself reminding educated U.S. citizens that the U.S. is still technically at war with the DPRK. In these conversations, I find myself educating U.S. citizens as to the dangers posed by such things as a preemptive strike. As you all know, such reckless military action risked the outbreak of war that could end in nuclear disaster or a conventional catastrophe. According to the U.S. Congressional Research Service, over 300,000 people would perish in the first days of a conventional conflict. The U.S. Department of Defense acknowledges that only a full-scale ground invasion, something for which there is no appetite in the U.S., would be needed to dismantle the DPRK's nuclear program. The prevalent lack of understanding of the conflict in the U.S. has allowed the U.S. government and media to portray the DPRK as a senseless, backward, and rogue state. This image of the DPRK has real ramifications at the level of human security. A climate of fear is noticeable in the U.S., as evidenced by the chaotic atmosphere in Hawaii just a few weeks ago. A simple mistake sent an alert to Hawaiians indicating that a missile was inbound toward their state. That simple human error, the click of a wrong button, illuminated a fear among U.S. citizens that a surprise attack from the DPRK may not just be possible, it may be imminent. How did we get to this point? AFSC recognizes this cycle of aggressive U.S. policy and the demonization of the DPRK in the U.S. media is diminishing Americans' sense of security. AFSC is an organization based on Quaker values. We work to uphold the expressions of faith found in Quaker testimonies. And particularly relevant for this situation is the Quaker testimony on integrity that encourages all to bear witness to the truth. With respect to Korea, AFSC has borne witness to this conflict since 1953, when we arrived to help in reconstruction efforts and refugee aid projects. In the decades that followed, AFSC stayed engaged in the region, and in 1980 became the first U.S. public affairs organization to enter the DPRK. AFSC staff worked tirelessly for entry into the DPRK out of concern for the security situation and for unresolved issues such as divided families. We have continued engaging with the DPRK since our original entry 38 years ago. The benefits of such engagements cannot be overstated. For example, in the late 1990s, as famine conditions arose in the DPRK, AFSC's citizen diplomacy efforts paid off, as the organization was one of the first to recognize the deteriorating conditions. AFSC quickly began humanitarian relief efforts. This aid, while modest in quantity, no doubt made an impact on the lives of those who received it. This serves as an example of the real human benefits of engagement, as dialogue begets cooperation. Today, AFSC continues to address food security in the DPRK through its agricultural assistance project in the country. AFSC's program works with 4 cooperative farms, the Academy of Agricultural Sciences, and K. Umsung College of Agriculture to raise productivity and implement sustainable agricultural practices. This program has had significant impacts on agricultural productivity in the DPRK through such things as the introduction of plastic trays for rice cultivation. Use of these plastic trays increases yields by 10 to 15%, and the trays are increasingly being adopted throughout the DPRK. However, programs such as AFSC's are facing a growing number of challenges in implementation, especially U.S. implemented programs. Last year, the Trump administration issued travel bans for both U.S. citizens traveling to the DPRK and for North Koreans traveling to the U.S. While we are encouraged that the State Department has, to date, continued to allow humanitarian travel to the DPRK under exemptions, AFSC strongly opposes these travel restrictions. The restrictions limit critical people-to-people connections and potential channels of dialogue. As the U.S. government increasingly relies upon fewer channels of communication with the DPRK, these travel restrictions are an unnecessary obstacle to improving relations and citizen diplomacy efforts. The greatest challenge, however, to U.S. humanitarian efforts has been the aggressive implementation of sanctions by the United States. Under the Obama administration, AFSC witnessed the gradual increase of complexity of sanctions, adding more layers of red tape for urgent and under-resourced humanitarian operations. Today, AFSC is witnessing the Trump administration's sharp increase in the use of sanctions, and now, more than ever, humanitarian operations are under assault by regulatory agencies. Some organizations, such as Save the Children, have even suspended operations in the DPRK due to the interference of sanctions. In 2016, the UN Development Program reported that about 18 million North Koreans were in need of some sort of humanitarian assistance. Just 1 year later, an independent UN expert reported that even UN agencies were having difficulty with shipments of humanitarian aid due to sanctions. The UN expert noted that equipment such as wheelchairs and cancer medications were being denied entry. Despite assurances from the US government that sanctions are not meant to hurt ordinary North Koreans, AFSC is bearing witness to another truth: that sanctions are having an indisputable impact on humanitarian assistance efforts in the DPRK. As global security starts with security for individuals, hindering humanitarian assistance is a sure way to undermine security at all levels. As evidenced by the challenges that AFSC and other organizations face in humanitarian efforts, opportunities for U.S. citizens and other international actors to constructively cooperate with North Koreans are being closed off one by one. Yet despite these attempts to sever people-to-people links, there remain connections between the U.S. and DPRK that cannot be regulated away. Thousands of Korean Americans are part of families divided by this ongoing war. In the past, these families were free to visit the DPRK to search for loved ones, and many of them were able to find and reunite with long-lost relatives. Today, these families are prohibited by U.S. travel restrictions from going to the DPRK simply to reunite, if only briefly, with a family member they may not have seen in decades. Within this tragedy of family separation, however, there is opportunity to restore living links between the U.S. and DPRK and to advance sincere diplomacy, one initiated with an embrace and based on enduring love, rather than a policy of aversion driven by fear. Some families, however, will never be afforded the opportunity to embrace each other once more, and yet their love endures. Families of the over 5,000 U.S. service members whose remains were left in the DPRK after the war are still searching for their loved ones today. From 1996 to 2005, the U.S. and DPRK carried out joint military operations to locate, collect, and repatriate the remains of U.S. service members. A successful exercise in cooperation that is still bringing closure to families today as the remains are identified and families are located. Here again, within tragedy, we find opportunity. Today, we know that the DPRK is currently holding 120 sets of collective remains that they are willing to hand over to a third party if the U.S. government publicly recognizes repatriation as a humanitarian issue. The North Koreans, it would seem, feel the issue has been politicized. Encouragingly, legislation addressing these ongoing humanitarian issues has been introduced in the U.S. House of Representatives last year. The legislation remains unfinalized, however, and while the measures would only require a report on the status of these issues, there is still resistance among key leaders in Congress to pass the legislation. These issues, though, offer appropriate means to begin de-escalating tensions and reconciling old wounds. Policymakers, then, neglect these issues not only at the expense of individuals and families, but at the expense of international security. Last year, AFSC celebrated its 100th anniversary. In that time, the organization has borne witness to conflicts such as World War I and II, the Chinese Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement in the United States, apartheid in South Africa, the Vietnam War, and many, many more. While most of the conflicts AFSC has witnessed over the last 100 years have ended, Korea remains unresolved. AFSC has now borne witness to this war for 65% of the organization's life, a statistic we lament. Despite political impasses, cooperation remains possible and potentially hugely rewarding. As we prepare to witness the two Koreas enter the Olympic ceremonies under one flag, we see the power of engagement and cooperation on a much grander scale. During a moment of such hostility, the two Koreas were able to transcend political differences by recognizing an opportunity and finding means of cooperation. That same type of cooperation is possible between the U.S. and DPRK, as AFSC has witnessed over the last 65 years. And so, again, we urge the U.S. to get in the games and begin engaging the DPRK. Thank you. Kamsahamnida.